ഈ സെഷന്റെ കൈകാര്യം ചെയ്യുന്ന ഇന്ത്യൻ അവസ്ഥ നേരെ അറിവുള്ള വിഷയത്തെ സംബന്ധിച്ചാണ്. പ്രഗത്ഭരായ രണ്ട് സാമ്പത്തിക ശാസ്ത്രജ്ഞരാണ് ഇവിടെ വിഷയം അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. നവ ഉദാരവൽക്കരണ നയങ്ങൾക്ക് ബദലുണ്ട് എന്നും ആ ബദലുകൾ എന്താണെന്ന് എണ്ണി പറയുന്ന രണ്ട് പ്രമുഖ ശാസ്ത്രജ്ഞരാണ് ഇന്ന് ഈ വിഷയം അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. മുഖ്യ പ്രഭാഷണം നിർവഹിക്കുന്നത് പ്രൊഫസർ പ്രഭാത് പട്നായിക്കാണ്. പ്രഭാത് പട്നായിക്കിനെ ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഇവിടെയുള്ള ആൾക്കാരോട് അദ്ദേഹത്തെ പരിചയപ്പെടുത്തേണ്ട ആവശ്യമില്ല. അദ്ദേഹം JNUവിൽ പ്രൊഫസറായിരുന്നു. എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയാവുന്ന കാര്യം. കഴിഞ്ഞ LDF ഭരണകാലത്ത് പ്ലാനിംഗ് ബോർഡിന്റെ വൈസ് ചെയർമാനായിരുന്നു. കേരള സർക്കാരിന്റെ വ്യത്യസ്തമായ നയ സമീപനം സ്വീകരിക്കുന്നതിന് ഉപദേശം നൽകിയ വ്യക്തിയാണ് അതുകൊണ്ട്. അദ്ദേഹം ഒരുപാട് ഗ്രന്ഥങ്ങൾ എഴുതിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. ചില ഗ്രന്ഥങ്ങളും ലേഖനങ്ങളൊക്കെ ഓക്സ്ഫോർഡ് തർജ്ജമ ചെയ്തു അല്ലാതെ ആൾക്കാരിലേക്ക് പ്രചരിപ്പിക്കാൻ ശ്രമിച്ചു. ഇന്ന് ഈ മുഖ്യ പ്രഭാഷണത്തിനായി എത്തിച്ചേർന്ന പ്രഭാത് പട്നായിക്കിനെ ഓക്സ്ഫോർഡിന്റെ പേരിൽ സംഘാടക സമിതിയുടെ പേരിൽ ഇവിടെ കൂടി എല്ലാവരുടെയും പേരിൽ ഞാൻ ഹാർദമായി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. അടുത്ത പ്രഭാഷണം നിർവഹിക്കുന്നത് പ്രൊഫസർ CP ചന്ദ്രശേഖരൻ അവർ. അദ്ദേഹം JNUവിലെ പ്രൊഫസറാണ്. ഇവർ രണ്ടുപേരും ഒരേ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെന്റിലാണ് ജോലി ചെയ്തിരുന്നത്. പ്രൊഫസർ പട്നായിക്കോട് റിട്ടയർ ചെയ്തു. CP ചന്ദ്രശേഖരൻ ഇപ്പോഴും അവിടെ തന്നെ ജോലി ചെയ്തു. അതേപോലെ കാലിക വിഷയങ്ങളെ സംബന്ധിച്ച് ലേഖനങ്ങൾ എഴുതുന്നതാണ്. അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ ഫ്രണ്ട് ലൈനിൽ അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ ലേഖനങ്ങൾ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് വായിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടാവും. ഇന്ത്യൻ സമ്പദ് വ്യവസ്ഥയെ സംബന്ധിച്ച് വളരെ ക്രിട്ടിക്കലായി വിമർശകരമായി ഈ സാമ്പത്തിക നയങ്ങളെ സംബന്ധിച്ചുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങൾ പരിശോധിച്ച് നമുക്ക് അറിവ് നൽകിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന വ്യക്തിയാണ്. ഓക്സ്ഫോർഡിന്റെ പേരിലും സംഘാടക സമിതിയുടെ പേരിലും ഇവിടെ കൂടിയ എല്ലാവരുടെ പേരിൽ അദ്ദേഹത്തെ ഞാൻ ഹാർദമായി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. ഈ യോഗത്തിന്റെ അധ്യക്ഷത വഹിക്കുന്നത് കുഞ്ഞിക്കണ്ണൻ മാഷാണ്. കുഞ്ഞിക്കണ്ണൻ മാഷ് കേരള സാഹിത്യ പരിഷത്തിന്റെ സെക്രട്ടറിയായും പ്രസിഡന്റായും പ്രവർത്തിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. അദ്ദേഹം അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഗവൺമെന്റ് കോളേജ് അധ്യാപകനായിരുന്നു റിട്ടയർ ചെയ്ത വ്യക്തിയാണ്. അദ്ദേഹത്തിനെ നിങ്ങൾ എല്ലാവരുടെയും പേരിൽ ഓക്സ്ഫോർഡിന് വേണ്ടി സംഘാടക സമിതിക്ക് വേണ്ടി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുക. മറ്റുള്ള വ്യക്തികളൊക്കെ നേരത്തെ സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് അറിയിക്കാൻ തരുന്നില്ല. ഇവിടെ എത്തിച്ചേർന്ന എല്ലാവരെയും കൂടി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് ഇതിന്റെ കാര്യങ്ങൾ നിയന്ത്രിക്കുന്നതിന് വേണ്ടി കുഞ്ഞിക്കണ്ണൻ മാഷിനെ ക്ഷണിക്കുന്നു.
ഈ സെഷന് പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും CP ചന്ദ്രശേഖരും അവരുടെ പ്രബന്ധങ്ങൾ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്ന ഈ സെഷനുകൾ പ്രത്യേകിച്ചൊരു ആമുഖമായ അധ്യക്ഷ പ്രസംഗം നടത്തുകാർ പറയുന്നത് തന്നെ ശരിയല്ല എന്ന് പൂർണ്ണ ബോധ്യമുള്ള ഒരാളാണ്. ഇവിടെ രണ്ട് പ്രബന്ധങ്ങളാണ് പ്രധാനമായും അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. ഇൻഡിപെൻഡന്റ് ഇന്ത്യ at 65, അത് പ്രൊഫസർ പ്രഭാത് പട്നായിക്കും. ഇന്ത്യ ഗ്രോത്ത് സ്റ്റോറി ആൻഡ് എൻഡ് ഓഫ് നിയോ ലിബറൽ ട്രയംഫലിസം എന്ന പ്രബന്ധം CP ചന്ദ്രശേഖരുമാണ് അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. അതിനുശേഷം നമുക്ക് ചർച്ചകൾ തുടരാം. ഫസ്റ്റ് ഐ റിക്വസ്റ്റ് പ്രൊഫസർ പ്രഭാത് to present his views on independent India at 65. Professor Prabhat.
Comrades and friends, it's a privilege to be associated with this event which is organized to honor Comrade Ems Smriti. Since the topic given to me is something on which I have written and it's in fact included in one of the volumes which has been brought out, much of what I may be saying would perhaps be somewhat repetitive for some of you, or at any rate very well known. So I'd like to apologize in advance if it is the case that I'm repeating things which are well known. Basically, because when we look at India, independent India at 65, we have to do so in a historical context. Let me begin by talking about the fact that 20th century India witnessed, to my mind, a major social revolution. This is clear if we look even at a state like Kerala, but it's clear even elsewhere In Kerala, for instance, you had not only untouchability but also unseeability. Starting from a situation of that kind at the beginning of the 20th century, the distance traversed was in fact quite significant. This social revolution was expressed in the very broad agenda of this social revolution was expressed in several documents, one of which, a very important document, was the Karachi Congress Resolution of 1931, which provided, among other things, for an electoral democracy based on universal adult franchise. It provided for a separation of the state from religion. It provided for equality before the law of everybody, irrespective of caste, status, gender, and so on. It provided for free and compulsory primary education, and it also provided for or visualized a situation where every Indian would be assured of a certain minimum level of livelihood. 1931, Karachi Congress Resolution preceded or roughly coincided with the impact of the world economic crisis under which the peasantry in every part of India was reeling. The fact that peasants reeling under the impact of the crisis came in large numbers to join the anti-colonial struggle is what gave the anti-colonial struggle a major boost. And in a sense, therefore, you can say that the Karachi Congress resolution in India, like the Freedom Charter in South Africa, really enthused people, drew them in large numbers, given the context, into the anti-colonial struggle. The fact that the Congress Party won in a majority of the states in the 1936-37 assembly elections was in no small measure due to this. Such was the impact of the crisis and of programs for the betterment of the peasantry that even in the Punjab, which was, as you know, the core of Pakistan, it was not the Muslim League that won the election, but the Unionist Party. As a result, you find that there was a certain enthusiasm, a certain social upsurge, which was carried forward on the basis of an agenda, and of course the Indian constitution that was framed later took over from this Karachi Congress resolution. Now, it was not just that it provided for all these. Underlying what it provided was a certain fundamental concept, and that concept was the following. When you talked about, let us say, equality, when you talked about democracy, when you talked about the fact that India is going to be a secular state, you did not mean what is often interpreted by the term, namely all religions would in fact be equally respected and so on. What you meant was a creation of a citizenship, a creation of a community of citizens that goes beyond their empirical, religious, caste, ethnic and such like contexts. In other words, you really visualized something beyond religion, the creation of a secular polity, and that secular polity based on a community of citizenship. Sometimes Indian secularism is interpreted to mean that, okay, respect for all religions. No, Indian secularism visualized not respect for all religions, but transcendence of religions in public sphere. And likewise, it also visualized giving this community of citizens a subject role historically. Many of you would remember that Marx had talked about the fact that the peasant continued to till his miserable patch of land. About Indian history, the peasant continued to till his miserable patch of land while empires around him were falling. That peasant, who had actually been a non-entity throughout history, was now expected to emerge to the role of a subject which would not be shackled by any empires of any kind whatsoever. So this was a very modern notion, and of course it was a notion that was adopted and which was carried forward in the Constitution. The preamble of the Constitution begins by saying, "We the people of India." It provides both a subject role to the people, and it invokes this notion of a community of people, which is in fact based on citizenship. Now that, of course, required the realization of that vision, the carrying forward of that social revolution required a number of conditions. One of these conditions, of course, was the building of an egalitarian economic order. The Karachi Congress itself had not said much about land reforms and so on, but later during the 1930s, the Congress party made it very clear that land reforms were very much on their agenda. But that kind of an egalitarian order, building of a secular democratic polity, is something which, while a part of it was realized at the time of independence through the constitution that we adopted, at the same time, there was a reneging from that social contract. I want to say that modern Indian nation was based, to my mind, on an implicit social contract from which there was a reneging that carried forward the social revolution up to a point, and what we are witnessing today, independent India at 65, is a veritable social counter-revolution. And in fact, the point I want to develop is that independent India at 65 is in the throes of a counter-revolution in a number of spheres. As I said, we began, of course, by reneging on the whole question of land reforms. Not only was there no land to the tiller, but landlordism continued, not necessarily of the old feudal landlordism, but of course landlordism, to the extent that it converted itself into capitalist landlordism, was allowed to continue. Therefore, land concentration continued. Within that land concentration, you had some elements like the old zamindars of UP and so on being eliminated, some rich peasants who are now kind of, becoming more prosperous, climbing up, but land concentration continued. Additionally, when you have an economic development trajectory that is based on unequal asset distributions to start with, and that trajectory is one of capitalist development which necessarily increases inequalities, it's not very surprising that subsequently inequalities increased. True that the post-independence development policy visualized the state under the dirigist regime of that period, planned development and so on, to intervene, to check these kinds of inequalities. The public sector played a major role as a check, not only on the operation of multinational corporations of foreign capital, but also of domestic monopoly houses. But at the same time, there is no doubt that inequalities continued, and of course this is something which actually had got Prime Minister Nehru sufficiently concerned to set up in 1960 a committee called the Mahalanobis Committee, which was supposed to investigate into the increase in inequalities in the Indian economy. The continuation, but at any rate even then, despite the fact that the major preconditions for realizing the Karachi vision were all being vitiated, at the same time, there is no doubt that there was at least a commitment to that vision. With neoliberalism, if that commitment goes, what you have, of course, neoliberalism was a product of certain conditions, a product of a condition in which finance capital becomes globalized. You have the emergence of international finance capital, which sucks in different countries into its orbit. You have a collapse of the Soviet Union, which in fact had provided a major bulwark role against the hegemony of imperialism earlier. You have also this rise in inequality that is taking place, and the ambitions of the domestic big bourgeoisie can no longer be fulfilled within a dirigist regime, but they in fact themselves would like to go global, and therefore for all these reasons you had the emergence of a new situation, a new policy, the neoliberal policy. And the neoliberal policy is one which basically implies that the domestic big bourgeoisie gets integrated into the flows of globalized capital. It itself becomes globalized, and of course you have the state, the domestic state increasingly being annexed to serve the interests of the domestic corporate financial elite, which in turn is also linked to international finance capital. Now, this entire trajectory, now we know, has brought the nation to a crisis. But even before it had brought the nation to a crisis, it had a number of implications which are worth emphasizing. Prakash referred to some of them, the enormous inequalities, enormous increase in inequalities in wealth and income, which is visible to everybody. And these days, nobody is apologetic about it. Nobody says, sorry, inequality has increased. They say, yes, inequality has increased. Just shows how good our entrepreneurs are. So there is an enormous increase in inequality, but not only an increase in inequality, there is in very crucial ways an actual absolute worsening of the nutritional standards, including of the calorie intake of the bulk of the population. I find it very amusing that when Amartya Sen was speaking the other day, he said that, look, Parliament must pass this food security legislation. Anyone holding a parliament and preventing this passing of food security legislation is responsible for the deaths of thousands of children. Now that basically implies what a horrible condition it must be that in a few weeks or months you have thousands of children dying. So in defending the government, he was implicitly actually making a very critical point about the extent of malnourishment and hunger that prevails in the Indian economy. And as everybody knows, at the moment, India's calorie intake is something which is even lower than that of sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps the extent of hunger in India is even greater than in sub-Saharan Africa. But it is not just the increase in inequality, the increase in hunger, but additionally the change that has come about in the nature of the state itself. The state, if you are pursuing a neoliberal policy, then in the neoliberal policy, the state is increasingly withdrawing from being an active participant in the economy by way of the public sector, by way of interfering in distribution, by way of interfering in production and so on, but increasingly becomes an aider and abettor as far as corporate financial elite is concerned, to induce it to undertake investment. And this, of course, is fundamentally in itself anti-democratic, because after all, this implies that no matter what the government is elected, all of them have to pursue the same neoliberal policy unless you break yourself away from this globalization link. You find that everybody has to pursue the same policy, which is to appease the corporate financial interests. It's quite interesting that at the moment we're in a crisis. The crisis is the product of the capitalist trajectory, the neoliberal trajectory that we have been following. And what is the argument about how we should get out of the crisis? Have more reforms. Anything which actually should be discredited for landing the country in a major crisis at the moment is actually used as an excuse in order to further movement along the very same trajectory. You know, Manmohan Singh quoted John Maynard Keynes the other day. John Maynard Keynes had talked about the animal spirits of the entrepreneurs underlying capitalist dynamic. Keynes had said that the animal spirits of entrepreneurs are not enough to generate full employment, to satisfy the workers and so on, and therefore it becomes necessary for the state to substitute for the animal spirits by itself undertaking socialization of investment. That it must ensure that enough state expenditure, enough investment, enough public investment takes place to keep the economy at full employment. What does Manmohan Singh, quoting Keynes, say? He says the animal spirits of the entrepreneurs is not enough. And therefore the state must boost these animal spirits of the entrepreneurs, not substitute for them by itself directly intervening, but boost the animal spirits of the entrepreneurs by giving even more concessions and so on. Allow FDI into every other sphere, open up all kinds of other spheres to the movement.